Got it. And in a second, it should be live. Okay, welcome everyone to the OWASP Cambridge chapter meeting, or Christmas chapter meeting 2021. I would like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Baljit Mahatra, who is going to be talking today about zero trust and API risk management. Dr. Baljit Mahatra is from Tej Lab in India, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Adrian, and the rest of the OWASP chapter at Cambridge. Really honored to be part of this community as well. I believe this is our first event outside the US and Canada chapters. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be with your community. My name is Baljit. I'm the founder and CEO of Tej Lab. We are based here in Canada, but we have presence in the US and India as well. Before I get started, I just want to quickly share some brief intro about myself. Before starting Tej Lab, I was the VP of Research at Black Duck Software. If you have used open source or other similar tools, perhaps you are familiar with the Black Duck brand. We were the market leaders in open source risk management. And before that, I was with SAP looking again around open source risk management. I've been trained as a computer scientist, but I started my career as a software engineer, building applications like most of you do. My specialization was applying data mining, data science techniques, more so later towards risk management related problems. And quite frankly, I'm not a security expert. My specialization is applying data science or data technologies for various problems. In this case, I happen to apply these technologies for risk management problems, and hence a very interesting journey so far. This is the agenda of the workshop today. And although this is the agenda I have outlined in a way that will provide us guidance how we proceed, but nonetheless, I want this to be more like a dialogue rather than a presentation. So I encourage everybody to participate or ask questions. My colleague Nicole is on the call as well. And I also request Adrian to monitor the chat. You guys have an interesting way of accepting questions through YouTube. I'm not sure, but I guess Nicole has figured that out. So please feel free to ask questions, and they will, if needed, they will pause me to answer those questions. And every now and then, I will also check with Adrian if we are doing well on time, and see if there are any questions. But let me quickly go through the agenda, what I intend to do for the rest of the time here. I want to start with sharing with you the local and the global view of how API ecosystems are evolving. And then I want to quickly move on to some of the risk-related problems that are being posed by these evolving API ecosystems. And then I want to talk about zero trust model, which is not necessarily a model for API risk management, but we'll see how we can adopt this model for API risk management. And then I intend to show you some hands-on practical scenarios. We will apply this model to manage or mitigate some of the API-related risks as I demonstrate these hands-on scenarios. I'll try to keep a few minutes at the end if there are any additional questions, but we will answer those questions as we proceed. So let me show you a simple illustration of API ecosystem. Now, I do not necessarily need to teach you what APIs are. You guys are expert, you know, you understand applications, how they are connected through these APIs. APIs as a concept have been existing for, more than 5 decades. But what has happened in the last 2 decades or so, many of these APIs that were locally connecting processes, making system calls to achieve certain functionalities, now they have found to be useful to expose them through internet or through web. So most of this discussion is around web APIs that are publicly available through the internet. And just as shown in this diagram, you may have an enterprise application that is connected to your payment gateway, to your social media channels, even to your e-place or e-markets. Now, the interesting thing that has happened in the last few years itself, I would say 5 years or so, APIs have taken over the digital world in a big way. Akamai recently estimated that 83% of the internet traffic is being generated by these web APIs. Now, this is a mind-boggling number, but also this is very, very important to know that this has posed certain security and compliance risks. As a matter of fact, Gartner has predicted that moving forward, majority of the web applications will be attacked through these different APIs. We did our own research. We wanted to see how much of this is actually widely spreaded over the internet. Basically, we took a sample of different websites, scanning millions of these websites to see how many publicly available APIs we could find. And our estimate shows that roughly 1 million APIs are already there. I was corrected that this number could be much more larger, and I tend to agree to that because as IoT takes off, as low-code, no-code applications take off, a lot of software and data is already moving into the cloud. And many of these digital services are connected through APIs. So this number will be much larger than what we anticipate. But again, this is a hard evidence that we see as of today when we did this research. It will not be surprising in the next 5 to 10 years, you will see these numbers to grow to millions and perhaps billions. Just like web grew, websites grew, these APIs, essentially they're transacting data or decisions, they will grow to millions as well. Now, I quickly want to show you another slide, which so let me do a quick change here. So hopefully you guys can see my screen again. Can you please confirm, Adrian or Nicole?
No, we can't. I only see your face for now.
I see. Okay, so my apologies for the interruption. Just give me 1 second again. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
Is it the full screen or just the?
No, you need to hit the present mode.
Okay. Which I did. For some reason, it is picking up.
That's it. Yep.
There we go. Perfect.
Yep. My apologies for the interruption. But this is a really important slide. For some reason, I don't know what happened with my mode here. but it switched to a different channel. So, okay, so what is happening at the global scale is actually happening at the enterprise level as well. And this is the slide I wanted to share with the audience. Here I'm trying to depict the enterprise API ecosystem. At the bottom of this this diagram or the picture, you will see certain tools that are essentially part of your API ecosystem. Software scanning tools, security workbench tools. Maybe you have a a network scanning tool and a bunch of other tools already in place. If you look at the right-hand side of this picture, then you also see API gateways or service mesh, which is essentially monitoring the usage of your APIs, inbound, outbound, or both. If you look at the left-hand side, then you may have API marketplaces. These could be marketplaces that are for your internal reasons or for your internal customers and partners, or you may actually have an API marketplace that you are exposing to your customers and partners for monetization reasons. On top of that, you may have different stakeholders that are consuming these services and whatnot. So the point I'm trying to make here is your API ecosystem may look very complex already. Managing or governing this API ecosystem is where the challenges are. And that the rest of the presentation assumes that, you will have this, not every enterprise has a similar footprint or similar ecosystem, but more or less you can start to relate what I'm talking about. Now, this presentation is all about API risk management. So let me share with you from this ecosystem, if we go down, what kind of APIs we see in a typical enterprise ecosystem. In the first category, you may have external APIs, which you are basically building for your customers and partners. Now, these could be external APIs that you're consuming from your customers, partners as well. Similarly, you may have internal APIs that are essentially built for your different business units. You may or may not be exposing them to the outside world. But this could also mean you may have certain internal APIs that are for your customers, partners, but not necessarily publicly available. So you have tight access control mechanisms in place. Now, the definitions of internal external APIs could themselves be very confusing or ambiguous. On top of that, you may have certain APIs that you do not even know. How is that possible? Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, when we started looking into different ecosystems, we found that open source is pervasive across different enterprises. If you look at your own application footprint, a lot of applications are open source driven. 80 to 90% of the applications are built using open source. So a developer may download a library from GitHub, assuming or trying to build a certain features or functionalities, not necessarily knowing there could be certain API integrations. And the difficult part is the ecosystem may be so complex because of you may acquire assets during merger and acquisitions, which make this application ecosystem even more complex. So not knowing your APIs are definitely very difficult for your security posture. And the rest of the presentation will actually focus on this particular scenario in a deeper sense as we make progress. I also want to show you certain data governance challenges that could occur because of this global API ecosystems. Now, this is a live snapshot of an enterprise API ecosystem where each dot represents either a vendor or an API that is hosted in a particular geography. Now, you may very much be a vendor or a consumer of an API whose vendor is based in a specific country, but that API may be hosted somewhere else. So essentially, when your data is being transacted, you are having data governance challenges as well. At the end of the day, these APIs are, making certain calls, transacting data, and providing certain services that are business critical, but at the same time, from a data sovereignty perspective, you have challenges. So let's look into some of the API risks that is the main theme of this presentation. But before I proceed, let me do a quick check with Nicole and Adrian. Are there any questions at this stage?
No questions at this stage.
Okay, great. So let me give you a couple of real examples before I get into some of the risk problems, and I will go talk in more detail about security problems. Now here, this is a real example of an API that we caught was leaking credit card information. And in this case, not only just the credit card information with the credit card numbers, but also expirations or security codes that will actually allow you to make real transactions. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. We found many such cases. And as I will proceed in this presentation, we'll see what are some of the common causes or the reasons behind these problems. We wanted to dig deeper inside this. And thanks to OWASP, your colleagues, with the OWASP top 10 API specific problems that you guys provide as a framework. We took those problems, not necessarily understanding how we can relate to the global API ecosystems, but what we did was we took NVD data. And as you know, NVD, it does not necessarily track only open source vulnerabilities or API specific problems, but what we did was we took last 10 or 15 years of data and we tried to map the specific problems that we can relate to API specific problems. In particular, if you look at this particular endpoint and these numbers that I'm showing here, this number represents the average score that we were tracking across all the vulnerabilities we can map to API specific problems. And these were the API specific problems, as you guys are very much familiar with, either broken access control problems or broken authorization problems or authentication problems. And this is the actual frequency. So among all the problems that we mapped, which were API specific problems, the top problems that we identified based on the evidence, the real evidence we saw from the vulnerabilities that were published, the majority were broken authorization and authentication problems. And you guys know that even OWASP has identified authentication and authorization problems as top problems in their OWASP top 10 API specific recommendations. So this really validates from the empirical results we collected that OWASP's recommendation is indeed on the track, or actually, what we can see as evidence from the vulnerability database. Of course, there are a lot of other vulnerabilities that are not necessarily reported to NVD, but as you know, NVD has a really good size of data, and this was a really interesting result for us. Now, the rest of the presentation, we're gonna focus on authentication authorization problems, but of course, there are other problems in the top 10, but we will basically stay focused on authentication authorization problems. So let me quickly review what authentication problems we are dealing with here. Now, simple things like APIs without having any protected mechanisms from authentication point of view. You can simply invoke these GET calls, POST calls without any authentication. Even in some cases, there were authentications in place. For example, API key-based mechanisms. We found that there were weak API key practices. In some cases, APIs, if APIs are stolen or keys are stolen, then basically, if you do not have a policy where you are forcing your users to rotate your API keys, can lead to certain data breaches and compromises. As you know, once you have the API key, essentially you have access to different resources that are tied to your API accesses. Similarly, even for more sophisticated multi-factor authentications, you could have tokens that are easy to guess, or tokens that are not expired or kept for long, which leads to compromised APIs. Now, authorization problems can be divided into two layers, or two categories: object level, function level, BOLA that you guys are familiar with. Now, in the case of object level, as you guys very much know, the idea is you address a particular resource with a specific URL. And you may think that you have an access control built on a specific resource which is authenticated, but simply because you're authenticated, you should not be getting access to other resources. And this is a typical problem we see with many APIs. Here, the example I'm showing here is, this represents a resource that is tied to a particular department. This represents another API that is tied to another resource from department 2. Simply because if I was authorized to access this resource does not necessarily mean that I am authorized to access this one. Simply because I was authenticated to access this should not give me automatic access to this one as well. That's where we see object level is broken, or object level authorization is broken.
Baljit, there's some questions on the chat.
Sure. Would you mind, Nicole, reading that for me, please?
Yes. Should data sovereignty undermine API security?
Or could data sovereignty undermine API security? Of course, these two problems are tied to each other. If your APIs are compromised, suddenly your data is leaking. But sovereignty is a different issue, in which case your APIs are not compromised. You are willingly accessing an API which is fully protected, but again, you may be storing your data at a place where you may have a GDPR compliant issues. For example, let's say your application was supposed to keep all the data in a specific geography, but suddenly this application is accessing an API which is hosted in a geography which is not part of your ecosystem. So even though your API is secured, compliant, but it may not be compliant simply because it is not adhering to some sovereignty rules that might already be placed as part of your enterprise policy or as rule of the law. Hopefully that answers the questions, but I'm happy to have a follow-up question. So feel free to type in back again. Nicole, is there any other question?
Yes. Relocation of assessor has primacy over location of data. Bias should be reversed to strengthen API security.
Would you mind repeating that again, Nicole, please?
Yeah, of course. Relocation of assessor has primacy over location of data. Bias should be reversed to strengthen API security.
Okay, if the question is, can you enforce certain rules on your vendors that are providing these services? Of course, you can do that. But if you're using a off-the-shelf API integrating with your application, you may or may not have SLAs in place. So for example, a lot of APIs, just like open source software became open source, a lot of APIs may be publicly available for free, but where you may not necessarily enforce some of those constraints. So yes, you as a buyer can enforce those constraints, but again, what kind of API it is? Is it a commercial? Is it a publicly available free API? So you may have to see those on case-to-case basis.
There's one more question. What about biometrics and two-factor?
That's a good question. So now, it is not always possible to have a multi-factor authentication in place for all kinds of APIs in your ecosystem. Essentially, APIs are designed for machine-to-machine communication. You need seamless integration with a lot of your business processes. So it is not always possible to have multi-factor authentication. But again, wherever you can, as I will discuss in the later part of my presentation, wherever you can, you should have multi-factor authentication, but it's not always possible. All right, Nicole, is there any other question?
No.
Okay, good. So I will continue then. So here I was going to talk about functional level authorization problems as well. And again, very similar to object level. Here the damage is that the entire function is compromised. And oftentimes your business logic is where you control your authorization. And certain frameworks provide certain functionalities, but a lot of times you have to customize your authorization practices. And in this case, you may have a certain part of the application that is built for your admins, but just in this case, a user may access certain resources that is more than just having access to a specific resource. Maybe you have access to all the resources, and these kind of problems could lead to even greater damages. Now, let me go into some of the API risk-related problems. And if you pay attention here, so far I've talked about authentication, authorization problems. I think with this audience is quite savvy. You guys are the authors of OWASP Top 10, so I don't need to teach you API security. But what I want to talk about the rest of the presentation is, how API security problems may lead to some of the other issues, which may be tied to financial risk, which may be tied to compliance risk, which may be tied to, other obligatory risks. So here is the diagram that I'm talking about. As you guys know, security is a never-ending business. It is often the case, or practically nobody claims that they are fully done. It's a 100% secured system, and they can rest for the rest of the year. It never happens. Security is always a moving target problem. Similarly, all these risks we are talking about here, it helps to mitigate those risks if you have a way to classify them, because APIs could have different business objectives. APIs could have different technical objectives. And depending on the positioning of these APIs, either from a technical perspective or a business perspective, and once these APIs are compromised, what is the impact on your organization, these risks could play a different role within your organization. And therefore, classifying those risks in a way that could make sense and you can prioritize those problems helps you mitigate those risks. As you can imagine, I mean, even in pen test or some of the other practices, when we were building tools for open source risk management, it was all about prioritization. Either you look into CVSS score, the methodology, or other tools, that's the principle behind it. How we can prioritize these risks and how we can prioritize those problems so that we can address the most important concerns. And that's the fundamental consideration here as well. I've already spoken about the security. Now let me go into the details about the legal, financial, operational, regulatory aspect. Legal risk understanding is very clear. Once your APIs are compromised, maybe this is transacting certain data, or maybe this is exposing customer information, their email addresses and whatnot. And if this API is basically compromised, giving access to all your customers' data, you can see if this is sensitive, you're looking at lawsuits and whatnot. So the legal implications are very, very obvious. Similarly, if you look at the financial risk, then not every API is designed for a multi-purpose reasons. For example, if you look at a payment transaction API, which is transacting real dollar values, you can immediately see if that API has compromised the financial impact. But that's not it. Let's talk about a social media API. Let's talk about a tweeting API. Now, a lot of times the tweet may have a certain dollar value for you. You know, there is a business a logic or whatnot that is generating revenue based on those transactions. Although these are not dollar transactions, but again, you know, this could have a dollar value at the end of the day. So if your API is shut down for a day or two, you can see the financial impact on you. So not necessarily only an API that is designed to do dollar transactions has a financial impact. You know, if this is an API that is transacting certain data that has a tangible cost associated at some point in time, you know, you can see the financial impact. For the operational aspect, you may be dealing with scenarios where you may not necessarily have an API that is compromised. You may not even have a legal issue. But again, the operational aspects could be very difficult. Let me share a real story with you. So I was part of a team that was responsible for conducting due diligence when we were acquiring assets, when we were buying companies. And one of the use cases we learned in a hard way was we had acquired an asset which got integrated, and all the assessment tools or due diligence that was conducted, obviously missed a certain key aspects, and those aspects were related to APIs. The long story short is, after the fact that this product was integrated, millions of lines of codes, suddenly 6 months down the road, this application started choking down. And eventually the problem was identified to a specific API call, and this API call was going into a routine simply because it could not fetch the data that was needed to work on the rest of the workflow. And that basically choked the entire application. So there was no tool in place for us to discover all the APIs that could be identified as part of the acquisition process or the due diligence process we conducted. Forget about who the vendors were and what were the underlying APIs. Were they free? Were they making any transactions that were going over the limits that were supposed to be adherence to based on SLAs and whatnot? So this was a nightmare. And suddenly, again, there is no security issue, there is no compliance issue, but again, it brought down the operations, and you can see, down the road, there could be financial impacts, there could be other aspects. You lose credibility. Now, the regulatory aspects, somebody asked the questions about data sovereignty. So regulatory aspects are very similar to that. So API risks that are rooted in regulatory aspects are what I described earlier. You may have an API, you may have a vendor that is based in a specific country, and you may think, okay, that's fine. We are using an API, image processing API or a speech processing API for our mobile app. And suddenly you realize that all the images that are being processed, that are being shipped by this API somewhere else. And all your data is being stored there. So, sooner or later you learn that these third-party APIs were not necessarily storing your data in a specific geography. Of course, you as a company, you may have done this due diligence in advance, but again, things could go wrong. Vendors could move their services to different places for cost-cutting reasons. There are a number of things could go in different directions. So again, no security issues. Suddenly you have an audit, let's say for GDPR reasons or whatnot, and you find out the scenario where certain third-party APIs were not disclosed, and even worse, when these APIs were transacting data that was stored somewhere else. Now, before I go into the next part of the presentation, let me check a quick, do a quick check with Adrian. Adrian, how we are doing on time? Am I going too slow, too fast? What's your feedback?
I think we are okay on time. I think we're going about right.
Great, thank you so much, Adrian, for the feedback. Nicole, any questions on the YouTube channel?
There was a comment. So Paul Smith argues that the bias of standard data sovereignty is wrong and undermines API security. Do you agree with that?
Sorry, could you repeat it again, please?
Yeah. So Paul Smith argues that the bias of standard data.
Sorry, what was the word? First word you said, post?
Oh, no, that's the name, Paul Smith, the name of the person.
Postman?
No, Paul Smith. One of the members in the audience is just asking you, the bias of standard data sovereignty is wrong and undermines API security. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I to be honest, I don't want to answer that question. I still did not fully understand. So let me see if I can go to how do I read those comments? Can you guide me?
Some chat.
Is it in the Zoom chat window?
Yeah.
Okay, just give me 1 second. Okay, so the question is, I guess this is by Paul, if I'm not wrong. Paul Smith urges that the bias of standard data sovereignty is wrong and undermines API security. Would Baljit agree? I guess that's what he wants to say. I'm not fully sure what do you mean by biased of standard data sovereignty. Of course, you may have certain API security framework in place, but data sovereignty is a completely different issue than your API security. Data sovereignty is all about what exactly these APIs are transacting. And in many ways, if this is a third-party API and you actually don't own this data, or if you're using this data as part of your application for, I don't know what the scenarios could be, then under certain laws, including GDPR, even though you are not the originator of the data, you are just a consumer of data, but you provide certain services based on that data. Then, of course, in many ways, how do you handle that data? How do you put security around that data, including API security if it is accessing those data? So again, so it is not a matter of whether that undermines your API security undermines the other way or not, but I think you have to look at what is the use case that you're talking about. So these two data sovereignty issues could be separate from your API security issues and what practices you're applying for your API security. But again, in some cases, they could be talking about the same problems. I tried my best to answer that question, but again, Paul, please feel free to type in any follow-up questions. If there is any, I'm happy to visit or revisit, come back and see, and if I can answer that again. All right, so I will continue. So I switched my screen. Hopefully my screen is still on, which says models for API risk management.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So now let's get into what are the different models. So again, I briefly touched upon security issues, in particular, the authentication, authorization related issues, and some questions were asked about data sovereignty. And I will show in my hands-on scenarios, how do we look into some of those issues when it comes to APIs ecosystem. Now, let me go into some of the models that we can adopt to manage API risks, the risks that I talked about from a financial perspective, from a legal perspective, from a security perspective. If you have not looked into Zero Trust, I encourage you to look into this. After this slide, I will share some resources where you can look into some of those resources. But let me quickly give you the overview of zero trust model. And again, my goal here is not to give you a complete drill down on this trust model, but again, just briefly touch upon the 7 basic principles that makes this trust a zero trust model. The very first principle of zero trust model is all data sources and software services must be treated as resource. Okay. All your communications that are accessing those resources must be secured. And the third principle is all the resources that you are accessing that are through secure channel must be accessed through sessional approaches. I will go into more detail a bit later, but the idea here is just because you have a resource that is secured, that does not necessarily mean that you have authenticated to be accessed all the time, all the places. So you need to have a sessional approach to access those resources. The policies that allow you to access those resources in a sessional way must be dynamic as well. We have seen this recently, not very recently, but a lot of good practices or best practices that organizations follow. When you change your location, for example, email system, they check and see you have changed your location or IP address. They see whether this is you who's trying to access specific resources in the example of emails, your email, of course. So they quickly adopt those policies in a dynamic way, either time and space or other use cases. Similarly, if you are providing access to different resources through secure channels, you have a dynamic policy, you have sessional approach to access those resources, you must still monitor all your resources. And very importantly, the sixth principle of zero trust model is all about having authentication and authorization in place when it comes to accessing your resources. And you can see that you can start to relate it, the independent study we did, where we empirically found that what are the top problems or top 2 problems that are affecting API security based on NVD data that we analyzed. And of course, OWASP recommendation of top 10 API specific problems, also accounts for authorization authentication recommendations. And interestingly enough, this is the 6th principle of zero trust model as well, where it is talking about enforcing authentication and authorization on all your resources. Last but not the least, monitoring your system is not necessarily enough for you. You must regularly collect more pieces of information to constantly evolve your policies and constantly tune up your models that are monitoring your security posture. Now, this is to say that you must collect information by which you can change your policies, by which even if you have an AI system in place, this needs to learn with new different parameters that you can only collect if you change your models or collect information by which you can define new policies that these AI systems can use to monitor your security posture. So all these 7 principles make up to your trust model, but again, it may not be possible to apply all these principles in all scenarios, in all situations. But when it comes to API security or risk management, I will say how nicely they can fit to your API risk management. But before I go there, as I promised, these are some of the resources you can access to learn more about zero trust model. Just like OWASP, there is another organization, CSA, perhaps you're familiar with. They have a specific group, and also folks at NIST, they have come up with their own reports, and the hyperlinks are provided. Feel free to access those. Now let me try to map this model to API risk management scenario. The very first principle was all about treating your resources. Okay, so APIs are no exception. So you must treat your APIs as resource. Okay, so a lot of companies have already a product approach towards their APIs. And similarly, you want to have all API communication secured. You cannot simply assume that in my previous example that I said, where I mentioned about different internal APIs, external APIs, you cannot simply assume that this is my internal APIs, it need not be secured. So you must have these APIs being communicated on secure channels. Similarly, you need to have a sessional approach when it comes to accessing resources that are enabled through APIs. Now, again, as I was explaining, somebody asked that question about data sovereignty and accessing some of these resources or the multi-factor authentication. Somebody asked that question. It may not be possible for you to apply multi-factor authentication when it comes to authenticating your APIs. Sometimes you may have OAuth framework in place for some of the APIs in which you need authentication from your customers. For example, medical would be a good example where you need a multi-factor authentication where you need to give access to certain resources to a third party, but again, with the consent of the users who basically own the data. So in that scenario, of course, OAuth would work. But if there is an API that needs to do more of a machine-to-machine transaction, it may not be possible to have a multi-factor authentication and hence a sessional approach. But again, the idea is you need to have all your APIs authenticated, but once they are there, you need to have a sessional approach, either token-based or API key-based or whatever authentication mechanisms are in place or access control mechanisms are in place. You need to have a sessional approach. That to say that I'm not saying you need to have a 1 hour approach, a 2 hours approach. Again, it depends on the nature of the APIs, depend on the nature of the business, what technical or business functionality these APIs provide, but you need to have a sessional approach. Similarly, the fourth principle was all about having dynamic policies around your API accesses. Just like the example I gave, when applications, certain parameters are changed either in time and space, and the user is asked whether they want to give access, or policies are checked whether the same level of access is needed or not. Similarly, API should not be exceptional. So you need to have dynamic policies when it comes to accessing these APIs. When it comes to monitoring, again, lot of platforms may or may not have monitoring capabilities. Some of the API gateways provide those capabilities, but gateways sometimes are not designed for very rich monitoring capabilities. Of course, it depends on what your customers allow you to store. And also, again, as I will explain, what kind of information you can regularly collect to evaluate your security posture of your APIs. But again, the idea is you must monitor your APIs simply because they are authenticated, they are authorized to access certain resources. You cannot take for granted that your APIs are not being abused. So when it comes to monitoring, you really need to see the behavior or the access pattern in which your APIs are being accessed or used. You may have certain scenarios where somebody is authenticated, authorized, but again, they may be very much positioned to abuse your APIs. The sixth principle, as I talked about, very much you guys are the experts about authentication and authorization related issues. But the idea here is enforce authentication authorizations across your API ecosystems. There should be no API without authentication authorization framework in place. So, last but not the least, you must collect your information about API usage on regular basis. Just because your monitoring may not be enough, so you need to have tools in place or mechanisms in place where you can collect additional information. Additional information could be you collect payloads, or you collect inputs to the APIs. For example, even if this is a authentication APIs, maybe an email is being stored, maybe you need to store it. Maybe your vendor who's providing this API, maybe they do not want you to store certain pieces of information. Or maybe you are a provider of an API and your customers do not want you to store their data. So again, it depends on your situation. It depends on the ecosystem you're part of. It depends on your customers. It depends on your SLAs or business strategy in place, what kind of information you can regularly collect and monitor it. Of course, we are living in GDPR world. You have to be respectful of those laws of the land. You have to be respectful of the policies, but again, do the best you can. But one of the core principles is monitoring may not be enough, policies may not be enough, so you must regularly collect additional pieces of information. So how do we do this? Can there be a way or a workflow by which you can manage these risks? Of course, you can adopt zero trust model in many different ways. Zero trust model is not a code that you can write to implement certain things, right? So there are various policies, there are various strategies, there are various processes you need to put in place. Here is a suggestion or a way to implement your API risk management workflow. You need to put a mechanism in place to know your API ecosystem quite well. Remember my slide where I talked about 3 kinds of API or 3 buckets of different APIs. You know, APIs that are internal, APIs that are external, APIs that are not known to you. So if you do not even know your APIs, then how do you manage risk? How do you assess, evaluate your security posture? So you must put mechanisms in place where you know your APIs. Once you know your APIs, you need to identify what could be the underlying security issues, what could be the underlying compliance issues. I talked about certain APIs that could be publicly available. There is no, they are best of the breed when it comes to their security posture. But are they legally compliant? What data they are transacting? Are they free? Are they free? Does not necessarily, the free does not necessarily mean that you don't have any obligations. So you need to identify all the security, technical, compliance risks that are underlying those APIs. Now, of course, this is not a one-time process. You must track these issues on an ongoing basis, right? You cannot be just done today and say, look, I evaluated all my APIs and I'm done. APIs are constantly evolving. Underlying databases could change. Your policies could change. APIs could move to different locations in terms of where they're deployed. All those things are possible. Therefore, you need to track these issues on an ongoing basis. And of course, you need to alert different stakeholders. And API ecosystems, very much like open source offices, there are multiple stakeholders within this ecosystem. As I showed in my diagram, you could have a licensing team that is responsible for the due diligence from a data sovereignty perspective or intellectual property perspective. You may have a procurement team that is responsible for vendor relationship management, for purchasing licenses and whatnot. At the same time, there could be development team, engineering team that are responsible for integrations or building APIs. Then, of course, there could be business units that are responsible for the strategy around API usages, if they are your APIs. But of course, then you could have business units that are consuming APIs. So you need to have a way to alert different stakeholders about different issues and risks that are emerging within your organization. Last but not the least, you need to make appropriate recommendations. Or recommendation could be as simple as, okay, this API is compromised, or authentication authorization is right, but this API suddenly is transacting this particular piece of information that was not supposed to go out. Maybe this was internal API. Maybe we need to shut down this API, or evolve these APIs to merge them into a specific service. So all kinds of recommendations are needed. Or from a data sovereignty perspective, I answer some of those questions. You need to look into licensing issues or other aspects of the recommendations that I talked about. Now, the rest of the presentation, as I promised, I'm going to give certain hands-on practical scenarios using our community platform. And I was told by Adrian, we can use certain hands-on experience, practical scenarios. If the time permits, I will go more than one or two scenarios. But again, I will give a quick pause to see if there are any questions at this stage before I go and start giving a demo.
Yeah, no more questions at this stage, Baljeet.
Thank you. And Adrian, once again, how am I doing? Am I going too slow, too fast, or the pace?
I think we are almost up to the hour mark, so we've got about half an hour.
Perfect, perfect. So I had slotted around 20 minutes for the demo and the hands-on scenarios. So we are good on time. Yep. I'll try to keep maybe 10 minutes for Q&A, and I'll try to hand back 5 minutes before we end the call.
Okay, that sounds good to me. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so let me sign in. I'm going to switch my screen again. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. What I'll do is provide this link in my chat window. So anybody who's interested in trying things out as I am demonstrating, feel free to do so. By the way, if I type in the chat window, can everybody see the link, or only the panel can see the link?
I'll paste it on YouTube.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So the community version I'm talking about is the platform, the community version of our platform, in which I will show this exact workflow that I talked about here. And I will talk about how do we do the discovery so that we can do assessment on the APIs we discovered. If we don't know those APIs, then of course, how do we identify the technical and legal issues? So I'm going to show that scenario, and I'm going to share my screen again. So Nicole, can you please confirm if you can see my browser?
Yeah, I can see the login page for the platform, the API manager.
Okay. Okay, so you're seeing the login page?
Yes, Baljeet.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Nicole. So you can sign in if you don't already have an account. Some of you may already have, but if you don't, you can create an account by signing up. But since I already have an account, I'm just going to log in. So this account that you will be signing in, this is a community version of the account. There are no costs. This is a community version of the platform. You have access for forever. So feel free to use it. And as the scenarios progress, you may have questions, so feel free to pause and ask me questions. The very first part of the demonstration I want to give is I want to okay, so the very first thing I want to show is you want to put certain scanning mechanisms in place for your, just like you would do for application security. You know, you may have static scanning tools, you may have dynamic scanning tools, but that's where you will start. So to save some time and quickly walk you through the results, I have already scanned certain applications where my focus is on discovering APIs or the snippets that allow me to do that kind of due diligence. And to make things interesting, I was looking into some of the OWASP tools that are available on GitHub OWASP page. And one of the tools that I found was AMAS. AMAS is a tool that is available by made available by the OWASP community, and you can see the link here. I'm not sure if my screen is the same where you see the GitHub page of this OWASP tool. Nicole, can you confirm? My apologies. For some reason, I'm connected with two screens and it switches when I change my screen.
Yes, we can see the GitHub profile.
Okay, great. So this is the tool that I'm talking about. So the scenario I'm going to show is exactly what I described in my workflow management, where I'm using a tool or an application. This could be an open source, this could be an enterprise application. The first thing I want to know is, do I know all my APIs? If not, then what can I do about it? So I've already scanned this application here. Some of the results that I found interesting is, here you can see I found some of the Twitter integrations which were part of this tool. Now, I'm not sure exactly why, but maybe this is because this application publishes some of those tweets once the vulnerabilities are discovered. Now, in this Twitter Go example, you see the Twitter integration here. Interestingly, you see the password and username here. Of course, now this is not hard-coded, which is a good practice. But again, the tool is focused on discovering not vulnerabilities, but the APIs. Remember, the goal here is, can I find all my APIs? In some cases, it does not discover, but it discovers certain snippets that gives you the indication that there could be certain API integrations. For example, I was quite curious to see that this API integration. Now this does not necessarily tell me that this is going to be invoked or not. Of course, this is a static analysis. Now, what additional things I can do is I can do a more of a black box testing or a dynamic analysis where my application is running and I can run a packet sniffing tool where I can see where all my traffic is going. So I will skip those details, but again, from within this tool, you can scan those applications. You can see what APIs are there. Not only you can see those APIs, but if you want to see what exactly this API does, you can have those. So let me show you those scenarios as well. So for example, after I discovered APIs, after my bill of material of the API is known, I want to know what these APIs do. For example, if I want to see live where exactly this API, what exactly this API is doing, where it is hosted, and some of those other pieces of information. So not only I discovered my APIs, but now I'm going a little bit deeper into this, doing more of a white box testing where I want to know what data this API may transact. Of course, I'm skipping some of the details. For example, how did you do the authorization authentication? How did I configure? How did I find out whether this is using tokens? And also, I'm skipping all those details, but I think you get the point. So now let me show you how I conduct my due diligence when I narrow down to this API. The first thing I want to do is, can I actually invoke this API to see what data it will be transacting? Of course, I've already configured my API and see if this gives me a live response. It did, but you know, all these invocations, you can see if I want to see what this API did, I can see whether this call was generated successful or not, where exactly this API hosted. For example, this guy is telling me that this is hosted in Texas, in the US, and the underlying ISP is Chupa. I actually did not know this particular vendor. But again, you see the point. Not only that, but let's say if I wanted to see what this API did, what data it is transacting. So after I made my call, I can see what exactly this API did, and so on and so forth. What is the input? Some pieces of information. Again, I can put that into my analysis and do either PI analysis or look at some of the pieces of information. For example, is it hosted on a server that is vulnerable and whatnot? So a lot of information is there. I'm trying to go really fast, but again, I think you get the point. Now let me show you a scenario from a legal perspective. So I think a lot of the security related issues you guys understand very much because you guys are the expert being a part of the OWASP community. But let me show you from a legal perspective. Just like security is a collective responsibility, legal compliance is also a collective responsibility. You cannot simply assume that legal compliance is a lawyer's issue. It's not my issue. But again, what tools can be given to developers who can make more informed decisions. So let me show you that scenario. The example I will use is, let's say, from a social media API perspective. Let's say I want to I'm trying to adjust my browser. So I'm just going to give the example of Twitter API. By the way, I'm also showing the concept of how you are organizing your API under different industries. Again, as part of your governance process, you want to organize your APIs by different business units and whatnot. But since I don't have time, I will skip those parts, but I will show you the example of the Twitter API that I promised. So let's say I wanted to see not only what Twitter I don't want Twilio, I want Twitter. So I'm going to use the Twitter example. So let's say after you did your due diligence that I know how to integrate this API, what's the authentication framework, this is secure, the vendor is known. So I have done all my due diligence. But let's say this is an API. Of course, in this case, they put it for free, but of course, free may not necessarily have that you can use it for commercial purposes and whatnot. So I'll come to that in a minute, but let me make a live call to this API to show you the scenario I wanted to talk about. So let's say I have a social media application which is consuming this API to collect all the latest tweets, and I'm doing sentiment analysis. So that's the rough scenario that I'm talking about. So let's say the application is collecting all these tweets, and in my case, I'm going to take the example of OWASP, and the goal here is I process all these tweets to do a sentiment analysis or a product review or whatnot. There could be many scenarios. The first thing I could do from a legal compliance perspective is I want to see, does this API transact any personal information? So you may want to conduct a quick PII analysis, for example, although I can already quickly see that the response looks great. They are adhering to the JSON response that I need to integrate with my application, either in a specific format and whatnot. So all the technical due diligence is done. From a data sovereignty perspective, I'm quickly able to see, is this API going to transact any particular pieces of information? Now, again, remember, there is no security problem here. It is just the nature of this API, what it does. And you are consuming this API in a way where you just are interested in the tweets of the people, not necessarily you want to store people's name because there could be certain obligations. As you can see that this particular API may bring certain pieces of information, people's screen name and whatnot. But by doing this analysis, I am able to quickly see what do I need to do. I can see where the tags are embedded. I can see which tags I need to drop and which data I need to store to be compliant. Furthermore, if I want to see what are the terms of services for this particular API that I need to know. Now, of course, if you go look at the terms of services that Twitter is providing, you may wonder, what do I need to do here? But again, there could be a lot of interesting things that lawyers do. First of all, looking into, even if this was a API, you have a commercial agreement in place, but that does not necessarily mean that you are always compliant. The fact is, many times these APIs could be governed by certain terms of services or laws of the land, even which are beyond control of this vendor, in this case Twitter. For example, they may change their terms of services, right? So how do you know? Do you go visit this every 6 months? Do you go do this assessment every few years or whatnot? What happens if the terms of services change and the Twitter does not want you to use their APIs in a specific way, regardless of you have a commercial agreement in place? So how can we help developers or security folks or even enterprises at large? So in this case, I'm showing you a specific tool where I can do what a lawyer would do to do a legal analysis on this agreement. I can track these changes. I can see what are my permissions, what are my obligations, what are my prohibitions. Again, the goal here is not to replace the lawyers. The goal here is to see, can a developer do a quick analysis to see the red flags? Then, of course, the developer can see how they're using this particular API, what vendor is saying, what to do, what not to do. And of course, they can discuss this with their legal team and define the use case or do whatever it takes for them to be compliant. Similarly, I already touched upon the issues of where the data might be stored. There could be vulnerabilities. Let's see if I can find out a particular scenario where I can show you even from a security perspective, there could be certain things that may be beyond your control. So just give me 1 second. Okay, so the use case I was looking for, I couldn't find. Maybe if I spend a minute or two, I might be able to find it. But again, I think you get the point. So you need to track. Remember the seventh principle of zero trust model. All the examples I demonstrated, they're all aligned with adopting a model that allows you to manage different risks from a security perspective, from a compliance perspective, and whatnot. The last scenario I will touch upon is these could be the third-party APIs, and you may not be able to do everything you can simply because these are APIs that you did not build. So what can you do from if you had built these APIs? So some of these things you can do, of course, you are very much familiar with the OWASP framework, where I can run certain test cases on my APIs. Some of these could be, looking into a sensitive data exposure problem, which is API 3, based on OWASP recommendation. Some of these could be related to checking authentication and authorization problems. And you could generate a report. So let me see if I can run quickly some of these test cases. And once I run these test cases, I want to see what is the security posture of my APIs. Of course, you can do this every week, every month, every quarterly, or whatever the frequency might be. But the goal is to adopt a framework, which is, in this case, I'm talking about OWASP top 10 API framework, as part of my zero trust model adoption, to see authentication, authorization, and all these different problems. And once I generate these reports, I can quickly see which test cases I passed, which test cases I failed, and perhaps, I should have a mechanism in place to see some of these results at the high level. And in this case, of course, I'm showing you this API has certain problems. Maybe certain test cases pass, certain test cases failed. In this case, it passed these test cases, but I couldn't run some of these test cases here. So again, the point is, can you do these kind of assessments on regular basis? If you're not, you need to put a process in place to do that. Of course, if you do this manually, that defeats the process of having monitoring in place. So you need to have mechanism in place where you can enable or empower your developers to do this in a more intelligent and automated way. So now let me switch back again. So I'm going to do the quick screen change again. Okay, so I switched back my screen again. So I got out of the demo mode and switched to the presentation mode. Hopefully you guys can see the screen. Now, I demonstrated this, this workflow where I did the due diligence by, first of all, finding my APIs, identifying legal issues, identifying security issues, finding different issues, and then of course we couldn't see the recommendation pieces, but I think you get the point. So these are the resources that you can access, which I've already shared with the audience. And very quickly, you have once again to summarize, you have API ecosystems that are evolving not only at the global scale, but also within your enterprises. The picture I showed you about different complex pieces that could be part of your API ecosystem may or may not necessarily be true for all the enterprises, but parts and pieces of those could very much be part of your enterprise ecosystem. And as APIs transform our digital world, API governance is very, very important for your cybersecurity program. You are not your security posture is not complete without securing your APIs. And governance is key to risk management. So I shared a model which is based on, or which is inspired by Zero Trust model, how you can adopt this model to manage your API risks. In particular, I showed a few scenarios in which you can apply a workflow within your enterprise ecosystem where you can manage API risk by using that model. I also shared the community version of our platform that you can use. This is free forever for the OWASP community members, or as a matter of fact, any community members that are using for their educational purposes. And this will be available to all our OWASP colleagues as well. At the end, I would like to say thank you to everyone, and Adrian and the rest of the OWASP team. Thank you so much for the opportunity to invite us to be part of this community. I'm very honored and humbled to be presenting to you guys. Hopefully this was educational to everybody, but I'm very happy to answer any questions, Adrian, if there are any. And at the end, I want to thank Nicole, who organized this and coordinated with Adrian to organize this session. Nicole, do you want to say a few words to our colleagues?
Yeah, thank you so much for joining. I hope that you learned more about the APIs today and you're more familiarized with the concept. I did want to offer you an invitation for a complimentary assessment. So please feel free to put your emails in chat if you would like to have a complimentary assessment. I will also put my email and Dr. Baljit's email there if you have any questions for us. Thank you so much again for coming today.
Thank you both very much, and thank you for everyone for joining. And we look forward to some new events in the new year. And say thanks again to Dr. Baljit Harl and to Nicole for offering and for a very informative talk. And I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thank you very much, everyone. And
Thank
good
you
evening.
so much. Thank you. Have a good evening.
And
Bye-bye.
good evening. Thank you. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.